Welcome on in, Eagles fans, to the No Huddle Show. We are getting closer by the moment to Sunday's NFC Championship game between the Eagles and the Minnesota Vikings at Lincoln Financial Field for the right to play in Super Bowl 52 and, of all places, Minneapolis, Minnesota. I, of course, am Matt Lombardo, and joining us here today on the No Huddle Show is Arif Hasan. He covers the Minnesota Vikings for Zone Coverage Minnesota at zonecoverage.com. You can follow Arif on Twitter at Arif Hasan NFL. Arif, thanks for taking a couple minutes to be with us here today.
Yeah, no problem. Thanks for having me.
Absolutely. Now, of course, Sunday's game between the Vikings and the Saints, certainly unorthodox, certainly exciting to the very end. And that miracle finish was really the talk of the entire NFL for the last couple of days here. Just take me through what it was like at US Bank Stadium and the reaction in the locker room from the Vikings when not only they realized that they were going to the NFC title game, but it was a miracle play from Case Keenum to Stephon Diggs that got them there.
I mean, the disbelief that everyone watching the game had about the play, it's kind of reflected of what happened in the locker room and in the stadium. I don't think anyone believed that play had actually happened after it had happened. The Vikings have actually cataloged this pretty well. There's a bunch of videos out there on Twitter now from the Vikings account and a couple of others about, how the players are just going like, what happened? Case Keenum has got his head in his hands, thinking like, what just happened? I have no idea what happened. And the emotions were so strong that they kind of overwhelm actually the memory of a lot of the process of the play. Diggs didn't believe as the play was happening that he had that much space in front of him. The locker room, of course, he was pretty jubilant and in disbelief. The phrase "loud silence." It kind of feels like that, where everyone was kind of speechless, but there was just so much noise at the same time. It's ecstatic. I mean, it's something that we haven't seen before, and I think Anthony Barr said it that these kind of things just don't happen to the Vikings. That's what a lot of the fans feel like too.
Sure.
That all these storybook endings happen in favor of another team against the Vikings a lot, but it doesn't really happen a lot for the Vikings.
Now, Arif, obviously there's been a lot of talk here in Philadelphia about the Eagles being underdogs, and there was a lot of anger within that locker room going into the Falcons game last week that the Eagles would have been underdogs at home. And you saw afterwards it was Chris Long and Lane Johnson kind of parading around in those underdog masks, and Lane Johnson actually did his interviews at his locker wearing the dog mask that him and Long had bought. Is there any worry at all in Minnesota, whether it be players that you talk to or fans on the outside that might be nervous that in terms of that emotion, just, that there could be a hangover from that miracle finish, that maybe all of the emotion that went into that play and the celebration afterwards, that there could be a risk of a hangover heading into the NFC title game?
I think if this was last year's Vikings team, I think that there's a pretty good risk of it. But I think they've learned a lot of their lessons from that, hot 5-0 start to the loss initiated by the Eagles last year, that they've kind of learned how to focus and take it, 1 week at a time and all that cliche. I think, there's a difference between, saying, we're on to Cincinnati, we're on to Philadelphia or whatever, and having a locker room kind of fully committed on task with focus towards that goal. And I think that, with a coach like Mike Zimmer and the offensive staff he has around him, the defensive staff he has around him with Pat Shurmur, George Edwards, I think they can do a pretty good job of keeping these players focused. They're a little bit more of a mature team, and they've got, I think, they've got a good kind of support group around them that allows them to kind of remain on task. So I think there's a risk of a hangover, but I think it's a lot smaller than it would have been had the same thing happened in sort of a prior season.
Now, obviously, these are two really different teams than the Eagles and Vikings that met last year. And you talked about the 5-0 start that the Eagles ended here at the Link. And that was obviously Sam Bradford was the quarterback over Case Keenum. It was a completely different running back, backfield. But outside of maybe those two elements of the team that we'll get into throughout the podcast here, what's the biggest difference between that team that showed up at Lincoln Financial Field and the one that's going to get off the buses on Sunday?
I think part of it is that everything's kind of come together. The first is, that Pat Shurmur has had the ability to kind of coordinate and set up an offseason game plan for the offense. The Eagles game, if I remember correctly, Pat Shurmur had kind of just been thrust into the role right before that game. Yep. As the offensive coordinator. And now, he's had the ability to kind of install his offense, take control of week-to-week game planning and stuff like that. And, kind of the biggest change on offense anyway is that offensive line. 4 or 5 different players, all 5 positions staffed with new player, with Joe Berger moving from center to left guard or to right guard. And the offensive line is much, much better. They do a pretty good job of preventing pressure from getting to the quarterback. Really important against the Eagles this week. And that's allowed them to open up the playbook and do a lot of different things and actually game plan against what they see. So against the Saints, who play a lot of press man coverage, we saw a lot of rub routes and mesh routes to take advantage of that, a lot of picks. And against the Eagles, I would imagine with a lot of off man coverage, you'd see maybe a lot more slants and stuff like that. They're a very kind of flexible offense. They didn't really have that last year. And defensively, it's just another year. They're an extraordinarily healthy team on defense. They may not have Andrew Sandejo, but he was a limited participant instead of a non-participant in practice today. So we may even see him too. And that means they've got their full defensive unit, which I don't think any team can really say that other than the Vikings. So that's going to help out a lot too.
When you look at this matchup, correct me if I'm wrong, but when I look at this thing, I look at two real mirror images of themselves. Two offenses that are at their best when they can run the ball effectively. Two backup quarterbacks. The wide receivers, you have Stefan Diggs over there in Minnesota, Alshon Jeffrey, who has played better against the Vikings than any other team in the NFL. But it's the defense for the Vikings that I think gives them a fighter's chance of winning this game in Philadelphia. They're the number one defense in the NFL. Obviously, you touch on some of the personnel, but you have an all-pro corner in Xavier Rhodes. You have a Pro Bowler in Anthony Barr. Eric Kendricks is as good as they come at middle linebacker. How are they exploitable? How can this Eagles team beat the Vikings? What's the key offensively for the Eagles going into this matchup, just based on you watching that Vikings defense throughout the course of the year?
Yeah, from the perspective of, finding a weakness and attacking it, which is kind of how a lot of offenses design themselves, there are potentially 2 weak points. The first, I just kind of briefly mentioned, Andrew Sandejo, who's playing the best football of his career. He just happens to be surrounded by 10 other guys that are just better. And so by kind of default, he's the quote-unquote weak link, even though he's playing as an above-average safety this year. If you can find ways to isolate him, maybe force the Vikings into cover 4, something like that, and run up the seam against him, maybe you could exploit something. But I think the biggest matchup for the Eagles in this game is Nelson Aguilar, who has been playing kind of out of his mind this year, and Mackenzie Alexander in the slot, or Terrence Newman. They kind of rotate the two of them based on whether or not they think it's going to be a running down. Sure. It's going to be tough, I think, for Mack or Newman to keep up with Nelson Aguilar. And that's, I think, where a big part of the matchup's going to be.
When I look at this game and I look back at the Eagles game against the Falcons on Saturday, it was Jay Ajayi, 54 really gritty yards. It was a rushing touchdown by LeGarrette Blount. The Eagles, this offense functions best when they can run the ball and they get all of their backs going, whether it's Ajayi, whether it's LeGarrette Blount, whether it's the rookie Corey Clement. But everybody who talks about the Eagles being the number one rushing defense, and that's true, it's only about 4 or 5 yards that separates the Eagles rushing defense from the Vikings rushing defense. What has made them so effective at stopping the run this year?
Yeah, this is one of the big differences from the Vikings defense this year and the Vikings defense from the past couple of years with Mike Zimmer, is that they've been a much better run defense. I think a lot of it has to do with the growth of Linval Joseph, who I think is the best 4-3 nose tackle in the league. Pretty good argument for like Damon Harrison and stuff like that, but he's up there. And that has helped them, kind of keep Eric Kendricks and Anthony Barr kind of clear. In terms of guards and centers getting up to the second level. But also Anthony Barr, who's playing a lot healthier this year, is really playing at a high level. Eric Hendricks is playing at a high level, and it's, I think, the first time you've got both of them playing at such a high level against the run that has kind of allowed them to do things like clean up. Everson Griffin's always been good against the run. Daniil Hunter replaced Brian Robinson. He's really good against the run too. But the difference, I think, has to do with how much better Joseph is playing and how both Kendricks and Barr are finally playing really well at the same time. And then Tom Johnson, he's like 33. He's really old
Sure.
for a defensive tackle. He's actually gotten much better defending the run every year he's been with the Vikings too, which is kind of astounding. So a lot of individual improvements, but a lot of it, I think, stems off of who I think maybe not the most talented, maybe number 2 or 3 on that defense, but the most important player on the defense, Linval Joseph.
Yeah, there's Joseph there, and then you talk about Everson Griffin, who's going to have a pretty favorable matchup, in my opinion, against left tackle Halapolaviti Vaitai. And I talked to a lot of Eagles offensive linemen, and Doug Peterson talked about this today during his press conference, the exotic nature of Mike Zimmer's blitz packages, whether it's the double A gap, whether it's bringing pressure off the edge. It seems like that's kind of his hallmark and his calling card, and has been throughout the course of his career. When you think about just the nature of those double A gap, blitzes, the impact that has on opposing quarterbacks, I think, is unbelievable. You talk about Tom Brady getting flustered when he has pressure up the middle. Eli Manning has talked about it all the time. Is that something that they talk about or that they make such a conscious effort to try to do week in and week out by bringing pressure not just off the edge but up the middle on opposing QBs?
Yeah, it's definitely an emphasis of theirs. And the thing is, they don't actually blitz all that much more often than most teams. In fact, for most of the year, they were in like the bottom third in terms of the number of blitzes they brought. But they're a very threatening defense in terms of blitzes. They've blitzed nickel cornerbacks off the edge. You've mentioned Anthony Barr and Eric Kendricks blitzing up the middle, not just up the A gap anymore. They've kind of expanded to attack guards on either gap with their linebackers and even tackles in either gap. It's kind of just in the same family of blitzes. And then Harrison Smith is probably one of the best blitzing safeties in the NFL, in addition to sort of all of the other talents that he has. And it really gives them a lot of flexibility to show a blitz. And often they'll drop back into coverage and only rush four. But because they showed a blitz, you have a bunch of one-on-one matchups and an offensive lineman who's blocking nobody. And that's really helped them a lot. Even when they do blitz, of course, they are very talented up front. And the thing that kind of makes it work really well is the sheer athleticism of both Kendricks and Anthony Barr. Because when you show blitzes like that, teams like to throw short, they like to throw a lot of screens, and it puts a lot of stress on those A-gap linebackers to get to the sideline as quickly as possible to shut down that screen. It takes a lot of athleticism from those players, and they both have that requisite athleticism so that if one of them does drop back or one of them does have to go after a screen on a blitz, they have the ability to do that. So it's not just their ability to actually generate pressure off the blitzes, it's that they can work off of the most common responses to what those blitzes generate.
Sure. Let's switch gears here and talk about the two offenses in this game a little bit. And I don't know about you, but if anybody told me back in July or August that we'd be sitting here on the precipice of AFC and NFC championship game weekend, and it would be Tom Brady and Blake Bortles against Nick Foles and Case Keenum, I would have told them they were out of their minds. I would have told them they were absolutely crazy. And that's one of the similarities between these two teams. Two backup quarterbacks. You had Keenum, who opened the year against, he being the backup to Sam Bradford. You had Nick Foles, of course, backing up Carson Wentz. Just how has Keenum been able to rally his teammates around him all year? And his first start against the Steelers, I think, is really the one defense where you can say they compare to the Eagles pretty similarly in terms of yards allowed, what they do personnel-wise. And the Steelers were able to take care of business 26-9. And I know that was a long time ago, but how have you seen Keenum kind of evolve through the year from that first start back in week 2 to where he is right now?
Well, I think Keenum has been there's been a couple of sort of evolutions. Part of it is that his ability to kind of actually take over the locker room and be more than just a placeholder, has allowed him to actually like demonstrate the leadership capabilities that he's kind of always had when he was at the University of Houston, and that he demonstrated even on a losing team with the Rams. He's been very well liked wherever he's been. And has the ability to confidently lead. But, it's obviously a lot more than that. There's a lot of really good leaders that don't pan out. Keenum has grown a lot as a quarterback, both in terms of his ability to kind of lead receivers. He's got a really stellar receiving core kind of helping him out with Adam Thielen and Stephon Diggs. But he's kind of done a better job of enabling them by putting the ball kind of in better and better spots as the years progressed. But more than that, he has kindly figured out what level of aggression he can kind of get away with or what he should do based on the defense that he's seeing. He's typically a very, very aggressive quarterback, but he doesn't really have, an arm to kind of match that. And so when we saw what he was doing with the Houston Texans, it wasn't really helping him out, and he kept on trying to dig himself out of holes with more and more aggressive passes. Now we're seeing a lot of aggression when it's warranted, letting, Stephon Diggs or Adam Thielen kind of chase down the ball. They're both excellent deep ball trackers. But sometimes when a team sells out against a deep pass, say, like the Atlanta Falcons are very often, what the Eagles do, he's willing to throw it short and have his receivers break tackles for him instead of having to try and test people deep. So it's that kind of maturity as a quarterback that's really helped him a lot.
Now, what's the perception like of Nick Foles and Case Keenum out there in Minnesota? Because when I look at Case Keenum, and I talked to a lot of players in the locker room about this today, Fletcher Cox compared him to a poor man's Russell Wilson. Chris Long says that he thinks he's a gunslinger, and he's basically a mini Brett Favre. You look at Keenum's numbers throughout the course of the year, he has the 7th best passer rating in the NFL, threw 23 touchdowns, and he's really took command of that locker room for Minnesota and kind of, planted his flag as the starting quarterback after the injuries last year to Teddy Bridgewater and Sam Bradford. But here in Philadelphia, you talk to people outside that locker room and fans and certain media types, and they look at this as, Case bleeping Keenum and Case the backup, and not really taking note of what he's been able to do this year. And he's kind of flown under the radar. And I'd imagine that when you talk to Vikings fans, you talk to Vikings players, I'd assume that perception is pretty similar to the outside view of Case Keenum of Nick Foles. How are people kind of looking at Nick Foles going into this game, going into an NFC title game?
Yeah, I mean, the team takes their opponents pretty seriously. I mean, they've been in the past beaten by quarterbacks that people don't hold in high regard, and so they kind of take every matchup seriously at this point. So, asking players about Nick Foles, you're going to get a lot of very serious responses and an actual analysis of the kind of things that he does well and what they have to watch out for. But I think that you're right in terms of the way that fans are viewing Foles here around Minnesota. They don't really see him as much of a threat. I mean, everyone is kind of aware that he had that stellar season in 2013, but they're willing to write it off as a fluke. And, that Atlanta game didn't inspire a ton of confidence either for people that were watching it. And so, they see a quarterback that, doesn't have the arm to get things done. The biggest difference, I think, between Foles and Keenum is that, Keenum is much more willing to, or has much more mobility and much more willing to kind of break things outside of the pocket. Foles doesn't really have as much athleticism. And so, they see a guy that might struggle under pressure and something like that, and not a particularly accurate quarterback. So they don't really see Foles as the threat that he may end up being, especially with the supporting cast he has around him and that running game to kind of back him up. And so I think that, your perception of the way that the Minnesota fans are taking a look at Nick Foles is pretty accurate.
Yeah, I'd expect that because, he's a guy who came in, he had 4 touchdowns against a JV defense, struggled mightily moving the football against the Raiders, really didn't inspire much confidence against the Cowboys. And I thought Foles played really well in the second half against the Falcons, but you're going to need a 60-minute effort out of either one of these quarterbacks if they're going to win this football game.
Yeah, no, absolutely. Especially because these defenses are going to keep things really close. I think the over-under is like 38 points. It's really low. Yep. And so any points are going to be really critical. And in order for you to get any of those points, you're going to have to be able to play a complete game. So having a 60-minute matchup where Keenum and Foles kind of duke it out doesn't sound that enticing when you say it at the beginning of the year. But at the end of the year, it's probably going to produce some really exciting football. And it's the quarterback that has the ability to kind of consistently push for an entire game. That's probably going to bring things out.
No, I totally agree. And that's why I think that if this were played in a vacuum and you're just looking at these two quarterbacks, the experience and the wealth of experience that Keenum has had throughout the course of the year, I think that outweighs Foles' production in the limited opportunities that he's been out there since Carson Wentz got hurt back in December. But how much do you take into account that this is going to be the third playoff game for Nick Foles? And I believe it's only the second playoff start for Case Keenum. Does playoff experience and discrepancy between the two really play a role in this thing, in your opinion?
A little bit. There have been like some statistical studies that indicate that once you control for kind of all of these other elements, how good we know a quarterback to be and stuff like that, the playoff experience, does kind of matter. It does have a substantial impact on the outcome of games. But the difference here, is pretty marginal in terms of playoff experience. And, I think that, they're both, veteran quarterbacks that don't really get slapped at the veteran label all that much. They've been through a lot of games. They've seen a lot of games, and they both have some marginal playoff experience. But I think that a lot of other factors are going to be a lot more important. How teams do well on the road or at home is probably going to be a bigger factor. The field was pretty slippery, against Atlanta. And so, if the Vikings, if it's going to be like that again, if the Vikings can kind of figure out, what they need to do in order to counter that I think is going to be more important than something like playoff experience.
Now, what's the mood like around town? Because you guys are in a really unique situation here in that the Vikings are on the doorstep of hosting a Super Bowl for the first time. It's never happened, whether it's Tampa Bay just missing out on the timing in terms of hosting a Super Bowl when they were making runs with John Gruden, whether it's any time that the Super Bowl has been played in San Diego, whether it's been, in San Francisco. It just hasn't worked out where a host city has the chance to have a home Super Bowl. So what's the vibe? Are people kind of looking past the Eagles and ahead to that Super Bowl party for 2 weeks, or is this a really focused team and focused fan base going into Sunday?
I think if you were to accuse the fan base of being unfocused, it would be focusing too much on what had just happened and not taking a look at the game ahead, instead of focusing too much on the Super Bowl and not looking at the game ahead. I think that's really the only kind of place where the fan base might not let down. But I don't think anyone is especially, with the Vikings history, is counting their eggs before they hatch. I don't think they see the Super Bowl as something that they have like a right to, or something that they see happening. I think they see Philadelphia as a very serious opponent, and the ones that are thinking about the Super Bowl are definitely thinking about Philadelphia first, just because Vikings fans have been, taunted too many times
Sure, just
with
like
the
Eagle
possibility.
fans.
Yeah, exactly.
They're
Yeah.
probably the winningest franchises that don't have a Vince Lombardi trophy hanging out in their trophy case.
Yeah, I think they may be 1 and 2 actually in that regard. So yeah, they're both pretty familiar with what can happen if you look too far ahead.
Arif, this has been terrific analysis. Appreciate all the time. Before I let you go, have to get your thoughts on how this game plays out and the prediction for Sunday.
Like I said, I do think it's going to be a really close game as a result of how talented those two defenses are. I do think that the difference in quality between, what I think of Keenum and what I think of Foles is going to help the Vikings win out. Just because, I think Foles is just a little bit more likely to throw some errant passes that results in some problems. And that's going to overcome what I think is a fairly substantial home field advantage for the Eagles. Still, it's going to be an exciting game. It's probably going to come down to the wire.
Quick game of complete this sentence before we let you get out of here. The Vikings win this game if
they continuously get pressure with the front four.
The Eagles win the game and go to the Super Bowl for the third time in franchise history if
they correctly isolate Nelson Aguilar against Mackenzie Alexander.
Terrific stuff, Arif Hasan. You can follow him on Twitter at Arif Hasan NFL. Read him at Zone Coverage Minnesota and check him out there at Zone Coverage MN. Arif, this has been terrific. Appreciate you taking the time and really look forward to seeing you at Lincoln Financial Field on Sunday afternoon.
Yeah, thanks for having me.
Thanks again to Arif Hasan, and if you want to check him out on Twitter, of course, give him a follow at Arif Hasan NFL. And I thought it was really interesting that once again he pointed to Nelson Aguilar as really the X factor for the Eagles and kind of a matchup nightmare for this Viking defense. And we've written a lot about the Viking defense throughout the course of the week. There's been a lot of chatter around Philadelphia about the number one rated Viking defense, how good they are against the run, how tough it is to move the football against them. And I agree with all of those things. And that's why all week I've kind of cautioned people in getting too optimistic about this game on Sunday and why I think it's going to be a low-scoring, knockdown, drag-him-out affair. But I thought it was kind of telling that he pointed to Nelson Aguilar because we talked all week last week leading up to the Atlanta game just how important it was to get him the ball in space to utilize his speed because Aguilar is probably one of the fastest players on that offense, and we saw it firsthand on that end around for a big gain against the Falcons. If the Eagles can do that again on Sunday, all it's going to take is one or two big plays to potentially turn the tide of this game in the Eagles' favor. And we'll see what happens in the quarterback duel. I think that Keenum is probably a more efficient and better quarterback than Nick Foles. But Foles, as we saw, was more than capable of eking out an ugly win when points were at a premium. So we'll see how that all plays out on Sunday. And as far as the podcast goes, Elliott Shore-Parks will rejoin me once again on Friday for our Fan Friday, our Complete Breakdown Friday podcast. And then we'll have the instant analysis wrap up from Lincoln Financial Field. So thanks again for listening. Thank you for subscribing as always on iTunes, on Spreaker, on SoundCloud, on iHeartRadio, following us on YouTube and subscribing there and leaving your comments there. It's always fun to see what people think of each episode. And if you haven't done it already, we'd love to hear your 5-star reviews, your feedback on the podcast. Give Elliott a follow on Twitter at Elliott Shore-Parks, and I'm at Matt Lombardo PHL. So until Friday, thanks again for listening to the No Huddle Show. I'm Matt Lombardo. We'll talk to you Friday and get you ready for the game against the Vikings.